Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Trauma Training Tuesday. I'm Amy Ebbison at Worcester Addresses Childhood Trauma, and I'm joined by my beautiful colleague, Kelsey Castillo Hopkins. Um, we're so excited to have TikTok famous celebrity with us today. Rachel, you have more TikTok followers than Congressman Jim McGovern. Just
Whoa.
saying, pretty proud of
Whoa.
you.
That is such a funny introduction. Thank you.
Right? Probably one of the few times you'll get compared to Jim McGovern, but it's not the worst comparison in the world. Um, so thankful for your work, and I know everybody here knows our topic today. Rachel's been looking at the intersection of police violence, gender-based violence, violence against women, domestic violence, sexual violence, and tracking it daily for 5 years now, Rachel.
hmm
I've been so grateful that I reached out to Rachel and she said, sure, I'll come talk to people in Worcester. And even just having a few conversations has helped me feel so much better about our not it's hard to say better about our scenario in Worcester, but to recognize that this is a much bigger problem, that this isn't unique to Worcester. There's some pieces that are unique to Worcester, like that DOJ report. Um, but I know from your work that this is a much bigger problem. It's a cultural problem. Um, and we're not alone in this struggle at all. Um, so I'm going to turn it over to you right away. And Rachel's plan is she's got about an hour's worth of content. And then on the other side of that, we have a good hour to talk about what she shared and what's going on. And Rachel knows, and I know that we have people here today that have been victimized by the Worcester Police in various ways. So this is an audience of impacted people. And again, we're really grateful that you're making the space to hear from us, talk to us, and even offering to help in any way that you can. And thank you from the bottom of my heart. I will be quiet now and turn it over to you. Did you everything looked okay with your screen share or everything you wanted to
Yeah,
do?
I think so. I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for that lovely introduction. That was so
We'll
kind.
be on, Kelsey and I will be on chat duty too. And I think, depending on what you feel like, it sounds like it probably makes sense for people to continue to use the chat to comment and question, but we'll hold it to the end.
Yeah,
Or do you want
absolutely.
to jump in?
I was gonna say that I tend to I've done a lot of trainings in my time as a social worker, and I do tend to like to, as much as I can, foster more of a conversation. So I know that it's hard, like unmuting, muting. So if you do have any like real-time questions about my slides or whatever I'm talking about, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll try my best to take a look at it. And then of course we have time after if I've missed it or just felt like a question that would probably be better answered with more space. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen really fast. Can everybody see my screen? If I can just get like thumbs up in the chat or some nods.
It looks
Beautiful,
great, Rachel. Looks great.
stunning, amazing. Well, hi everybody. Again, thank you so much, Amy, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I've so enjoyed getting to know Amy and getting to know about Worcester. I am originally not at all from the East Coast. I'm actually from Ohio. I'm a Midwestern girl. I live in New York now. So I really have learned so much from Amy about what Worcester has gone through as of late and of what Worcester has gone through, of course, in many decades, and just very grateful to be here. So, as she kind of mentioned, I will be talking about police sexual violence, sort of specifically. I've been researching the intersection of sexual violence and policing for several years now, as Amy had mentioned. And I really think that it is a glaring, overlooked policing issue that is both often excluded from conversations about the legal system and also very much excluded sometimes from conversations about gender-based violence. This presentation is very much not about me. This presentation will be pretty focused on my research and what I've observed in the last few years. But really quickly, just so you know a little bit about who will be talking to you in the next hour. My name is, of course, Rachel. I'm a social worker by training. These days, I pretty much dedicate my whole life to researching police sexual violence and making a lot of online educational content on the topic. As Amy mentioned, I do keep a daily tracker of law enforcement officers across the country who have been arrested for a sex crime. And I've been doing the daily tracker now for I think like going on 3 years, but I've been sort of involved in the topic of police sexual violence for sort of many years past that. Really quickly, I'm sure Amy can send out my email after today is finished, but if you want to get it down, and plus any sort of content that I'm talking about, my data, other breakdowns, more long-winded information is always available at my Substack, which I'm sure we can also send out as well. But moving right along ahead, unfortunately, this is a topic where I always feel I need to give a content warning. Not to say that we will be going into really sort of specific detail about cases of sexual assault by law enforcement, but of course, this presentation does contain information regarding sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and child sexual abuse material. So I really encourage you, some of this information can be hard to process, can be painful to think about. So I really encourage you to take care of your well-being and whatever that looks like. If you want to be off camera, if you need to take a step back and come back to the content, if you're like, I need to take a step back and sort of disengage and leave, I will not be offended. I would like you to take care of yourself in whatever way that that looks best. Now, with that being said, we'll get right into it. I can click it. So what is police sexual violence? I get that question a lot because it's kind of wordy and it encompasses many forms of systemic violence. So the shortest way I put it, of course, is always police sexual violence is when law enforcement officers are using their power to sexually assault people in their community. This encompasses sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and sexual harassment by law enforcement. And from what I've observed, the most common acts of sexual violence by law enforcement include sexual assault of women in custody, child sexual abuse, and the possession and promotion of child sexual abuse material, which is, to be clear, kind of the most, is now the best practice term for child pornography. I keep on hitting my arrow and it's not working. So why do I focus on the police? That is by far the biggest question that I get asked. Particularly as Amy mentioned, I post a lot on the internet, which I get a range of reactions when I talk about police sexual violence. But one of the biggest questions I get is why aren't you focused on other careers? Other careers have people in them that sexually assault others. And of course, that's true. Sexual assault is so pervasive across communities, and anybody from any career can sexually assault someone, of course. I always make the very clear distinction, though, that only law enforcement can carry weapons, detain people in handcuffs, and choose how, when, or if to enforce the law as a part of their job that we, of course, paid for with our tax dollars. And I always bring up as well that, these are the people that, of course, depending on your community and depending on your upbringing, a lot of people experience from a really young age a lot of media messaging that really promotes this inherent trust that we have in law enforcement from a young age. We sign a very specific social contract with law enforcement. We enable them with so much power over us and our communities with the agreement that they serve and protect, quote unquote. And yet we see often that they break this social contract time and time again. And the question that really leads my work, and this will not be the first time that I, or last time that I say this question, which is where do we go for help if the very people meant to protect us are the very people abusing us? I really lead all of my work with that question, and I have yet to find a really good answer for it. Um, Moving forward, this is based off a lot of the data that I have gathered in the last few years. This violence is happening in every corner of the country, every single day. I observed for every single day in 2025, at least one law enforcement officer was arrested or sentenced for a sex crime. Sorry, my throat's getting a little scratchy. One second.
You're
There we
doing
go.
great. I love everything you shared already.
Thank you. Sorry, the weather is so bad here. I feel like my throat is always get acts up. So if you can't hear me very well, also please let me know. which is a really staggering statistic going back to for every single day in 2025, at least one enforcement officer was arrested or sentenced for a sex crime. And this year, particularly, the numbers are looking kind of even more. I've started to separate in 2026 here arrests from sentences as I gather all of these cases, and it's looking like just at least one law enforcement officer has just been arrested for a sex crime in 2026 so far for every single day, which is again a really staggering statistic. But as we move forward, there's this understanding that that really is a floor and not a ceiling. But for last year, law enforcement officers from 49 out of 50 states, including Washington, D.C., were arrested for sex crimes predominantly against women and children. The only state that I could not find arrest reports in was Alaska. I am really keen, though, to give a massive caveat with that fact because this is not to say that police sexual violence is not happening in Alaska. Alaska is so sort of insular and alienated, particularly from the rest of the legal system, and their policing system is what I'll call like enormously like nepotistic. So it's, fathers and sons and people getting jobs with very little training in their legal system. They actually have the highest sort of rate of police killing in 2025 per capita. They also have the highest homicide rate of women murdered by men in the country in 2025 per capita. So there is an enormous understanding that police sexual violence is very much likely happening in Alaska. I just haven't been able to find any public arrest records from the state. So I give that massive caveat because, of course, anybody that knows the history of Alaska and, of course, an enormous history of violence against Indigenous women, it's pretty likely that police sexual violence is happening there. This abuse can occur on duty under the color of law and can occur off duty. But I'm pretty keen always to emphasize how much, even when an officer is off duty, the threat of their implicit power over their community remains, even when an officer isn't necessarily like fully on the job. Their power over their community, even off duty, is pretty implicit. Officers have a socialization that can sometimes mean intimidation or coercion, even when they aren't in the setting of their regular work hours. So both contexts abuse an officer's power over their community, even when sexual assault is not occurring, again, like exactly within the hours of when they are considered on duty. And to be clear, and this is kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about the data that I'm collecting is a floor and not a ceiling. The data I collect includes only those officers who have been arrested and anybody with a pretty elementary understanding of the legal system can understand that there might be a lot of obstacles that would get in the way of an arrest happening from the moment someone has been violated by a law enforcement officer in this way. So, for a law enforcement officer to be arrested for a sex crime and for me to be able to be aware of it and include it in my research, at least these three things must happen. And at any given time, something might occur that prevents one of these things from taking place. So, first, the survivor, the person that's been harmed, has to find the unbelievable courage to report what's happened to them to the colleagues of the very person that has harmed them. And I hear so often from particularly people who consume my work on the internet that they have experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment or dating abuse, domestic violence at the hands of a law enforcement officer, and they never reported it. And to me, that makes perfect sense. I would never in a million years judge someone who felt they couldn't report what's happened to them to law enforcement, even if the person that harmed them wasn't a police officer. There are a lot of enormously understandable reasons why someone would not report that this has happened to them to the police. But let's say a survivor does report what's happened to them to, again, the colleagues of the very person who has harmed them. The police then must actually be willing to take that person's account and take that report seriously. And we can, of course, probably assume that in a lot of cases, law enforcement might not be that willing to take a report like that seriously, particularly if the report is accusing a colleague, oftentimes considered like a brother in arms, a brother in blue, of something so heinous and violent. But then, even if they're like, okay, we'll take your report, we'll look into this. Law enforcement must actually be willing to investigate seriously and be willing to decide that the evidence that they've gathered warrants an arrest. And then that arrest must be made public for me to be able to include it in my tracking. And as you can imagine, there are so many obstacles and so many interpersonal decisions, I'll say, that can prevent one of these steps from happening. And then I will never know as a part of my research that this took place. Of course, I do track a lot of cases where an arrest was made and I should have put this, a prosecutor or a DA declined to press charges. And that is a whole other issue that it really touches this that I won't get super into right now. But you may have heard of cases where a police officer was initially arrested, and for whatever reason, oftentimes a prosecutor decides that they don't want to fully press charges against a police officer. But that's that's a discussion for a later time. Um, it's very devastating to, again, to think about just how many people have experienced police sexual violence that we'll never know about. Again, because for very understandable reasons, someone might feel as though reporting to law enforcement isn't an option. And again, that makes complete sense to me. It's frustrating that we have a legal system built in this way that when people experience traumas like this, we have a system that forces them to report again to the very system that abused them. And I always really lead, like if you ever consume any of my sort of content online or you check out my Substack, I lead with this slide in particular really often because for as many arrests as I've gathered, I know that there are so many more instances of police sexual violence happening that I just won't know about. And then that fact is pretty devastating. As we move forward, though, another question I get asked really often are like, what are the patterns I'm observing in the data that I'm collecting? What are the settings in which police officers, law enforcement officers are sexually assaulting people? And to be clear, police sexual violence can happen pretty much in any setting where an officer is around. There isn't necessarily like specific settings where it never happens. I have a handful I'm going to talk about that I observe most frequently, but unfortunately, I have seen cases of police officers sexually assaulting people in pretty much every setting or environment you can think of. This is, I would argue, the biggest pattern that I observe, of course, which is that law enforcement officers can sexually assault people under threat of arrest or in police custody. So in 2025, dozens of women alleged sexual coercion under threat of arrest by a police officer. What that often looks like is a police officer saying, you know, I won't arrest you if you engage in these sex acts with me. And often, you know, police officers can come up with, for lack of a better way of putting it, bogus reasons as to even threaten to arrest someone. It's not, it's very rarely, honestly, but that someone is doing something that would even require the threat of arrest. But of course, even if there is something that necessarily is a reason why an officer might arrest someone, it still is absolutely abhorrent and never gives a law enforcement officer permission to use that as a means to coerce someone into sexual activity. This is one example of this happening in Illinois last year. A woman filed a lawsuit against a police officer. She was walking down a sort of road to go home one night, and it was dark, and she was pulled over by a police officer for the reason of, if I remember correctly, not having a flashlight as she was walking, which is, of course, not illegal. But she was pulled over, and she accuses that officer of planting a bottle of pills on her person. And then he allegedly told her that he would get rid of this bottle of pills if she would engage in sexual activity with him. This quote is just very haunting and comes directly out of the civil lawsuit that she filed. I'll make you a deal. We can just throw those pills away and you get in the car, we take care of business, and you go home. That really stuck with me and is a case I think about often, particularly as, from my understanding, this police officer never faced criminal charges for this alleged assault. The woman was only able to file a civil lawsuit, which happens again pretty frequently. Whether a police department doesn't want to arrest someone, or again, very often, potentially an arrest has been made, but a prosecutor or a DA declines to press charges. Oftentimes, a civil lawsuit is really the only way for a survivor of sexual assault by a police officer is able to, through the legal system, get any means of justice. I understand that there potentially, depending on how much you know about the policing system, might be questions about qualified immunity. Qualified immunity, of course, only covers civil lawsuits for police officers. But I will say, as devastating as qualified immunity laws are, and how much I'm against qualified immunity, fortunately, qualified immunity very rarely is allowed to be a defense for a civil lawsuit against a police officer for sexual assault. Occasionally, officers try, but it more often than not gets tossed as a defense for them, which in this instance is good, of course, because it would be enormously difficult to sue police officers for sexual assault if qualified immunity applied to them in those settings. We can talk about that later, of course, but I know that when I talk about civil lawsuits, sometimes questions about qualified immunity come up, and more often than not, like I said, for these types of lawsuits, qualified immunity is kind of thrown out. So who else is getting targeted the most with this type of violence? Really devastating. I think one of the biggest patterns I've seen as of late that has really come just from me consuming cases after cases is women who are calling the police for help. This, again, the only word I keep using is just devastating because it feels just devastating to think about the settings in which this is happening so regularly. But this is particularly happening against women who are domestic violence survivors. I see constantly women who have called the police for help because they are experiencing some type of domestic abuse. And in that already enormously traumatizing and vulnerable situation, they are often facing the compounded trauma of being sexually assaulted by the responding officer. And this is just one example. I didn't want to completely overload this presentation with just like case information, but I wanted to highlight this for a few reasons. Of course, in Texas last year, a police officer was arrested for indecent assault after responding to a domestic violence call. He offered to walk a woman back to her apartment, who had again called the police for help when facing domestic violence. And he is accused of going on to sexually assault her back in her apartment. He had been sexually harassing her in the initial sort of response. And both he and his fellow officer reportedly turned off their body cameras to avoid recording the alleged harassment. I bring this up because another kind of common comment I might get on the internet is this notion that well, a good cop will step in to prevent a bad cop from harming someone. And I will say, in my time consuming so many of these cases, I have never seen another cop step in to prevent a different cop from sexually assaulting or sexually harassing someone. More often than not, it is cases where another officer was there and might not have directly engaged with that harassment or assault, but are complicit in the sense that they are not stepping in. They are helping to bury evidence in this way of turning off their body cameras. I am curious to talk later about. Amy had sent me some of the sort of reactions to, I know, Worcester's city manager declining to want to create a civilian review board, and had kind of pitched this idea that if everybody gets body cameras, then the issues of police violence will be addressed. And the unfortunate part is that police cameras can be turned off, and they regularly are. And we're finding that for as helpful as body camera footage can be, it is not a foolproof solution, particularly as police officers very often decide when to turn on their body camera and, of course, when to turn it off. Moving forward, again, another setting that you can tell I was pretty insistent about making sure pops on this presentation is this setting of traffic stops. So, traffic stops are a distinctly vulnerable legal setting for women, particularly. I think when it comes to policing, I think probably in my time researching this issue, calling the police for help and traffic stops are likely two of the most vulnerable environments, particularly when it comes to a lack of legal protections that women can be in. And we'll talk a little bit more about something called the law enforcement consent loophole in a little bit. But there are sometimes laws that protect people when in police custody. And the hard part about traffic stops is they are not officially in custody, but are still detained in that moment. And so it's this, when it comes to legal protections, this enormous gray area where like these legal protections don't apply because someone isn't necessarily officially in custody, but people don't feel free to do as they please at a traffic stop either. I mean, if you've ever been pulled over by a police officer, there's really this impression of intimidation and deference to whatever that law enforcement officer is telling you. So officers take advantage of the fact that there really isn't necessarily any real legal protections for whoever they're stopping because they aren't officially in custody, but they're really, for lack of a better way of putting it, in charge in those moments. And people feel a real implicit need to obey whatever a police officer says at a traffic stop. So I see cases where people have been sexually assaulted by police officers at traffic stops specifically, um, all the time. So, so far in 2026, officers out of Hawaii, Illinois, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas have all been arrested for sexually assaulting women at traffic stops. Again, we're only like halfway through the year-ish. So that list of states will continue to grow. And of course, I hope as everybody is processing this information, we're keeping with us what I kept on reiterating about these are just arrests. And we know that so many steps have to happen in order for me to be able to include this data in my tracking. Again, these are just the ones that are reported, officers actually arrested, and those details were actually made public in order for me to be able to find them. It is absurd to me how dangerous traffic stops are. Of course, we can think of also so many fatal police shootings that happen at traffic stops. So many cases of police brutality happening at traffic stops. And generally across the country, there are very little legal protections at all for anybody, whether they're a woman or a man or any gender or a child, or depending on the situation. There are so little legal protections for people who are in this really specific setting. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see so much violence of all kinds happening at traffic stops. And then, of course, I wanted to highlight this as well, particularly because I've read a lot of the DOJ report that was released about the Worcester Police Department, that sort of groups that are women who are engaged in the sex work industry, as well as women who are experiencing homelessness, are enormously preyed upon by law enforcement as well. Police often similarly use this threat of arrest to force women into non-consensual sex acts. And for very understandable reasons, women in the sex work industry and women experiencing homelessness feel a distrust with law enforcement. So they are unlikely compared to necessarily other groups to report their experiences to law enforcement. And law enforcement know this And they can often take advantage of the fact that these groups of women feel neglected, left out for very good reason, feel those ways by our legal system. And they have such few protections. So I think, and I often say that, again, police officers know this, and there is such a historical pattern across the country of police officers coercing, manipulating, or just engaging in real acts of violence against these groups of women. So there's one last group of people who are really targeted with police sexual violence. And again, I'm kind of doing a sort of, I know it might seem really detailed. For me, it feels like sort of like a cursory, sort of like basic foundation of the topic. There is so much in all of these cases and so much in these trends that I'm also happy to talk about after, but really just wanted to be able to give you guys at least some sort of basic information about what I've observed. And the last group of people who are really targeted by police sexual violence are, of course, children. Young people, particularly teenage girls, are experiencing police sexual violence across the country at just a staggering level of violence. Last year, of all of the cases that I researched, over 60% that I saw were sex crimes involving child sexual abuse. And that can look like many different things, of course, but it is particularly really devastating that the very people that are tasked with enforcing the law and have again entered into this agreement with their community that they will protect and serve can use that power to sexually assault, abuse, coerce, manipulate our most vulnerable, which is, of course, young people who are still figuring out who they are and where they fit in the world and who they trust and how the systems around them work. And I think it's a really shocking statistic that 40% of all police officers convicted, again, not accused, convicted of child sexual abuse will never see a single day in jail. That actually comes from this Washington Post investigation that I have highlighted on the right. If I remember correctly, I think this investigation came out in 2024. It's a really, really excellent piece. It's excellent and also heartbreaking. So a heads up if you would like to read it. It's great, but it really goes in depth about child sexual abuse by law enforcement specifically. It does focus solely on child sexual abuse, so very little about sexual assault of like adults or adult women particularly. But it is a great piece, and I'm very grateful that some mainstream media does pick up the issue of police sexual violence because very often they don't. So I see cases against children every single week. Sometimes it's every single day, depending on the week. And it's again, when I think about our legal system and the way that we've built it, and of course built our policing system, and the things that we tell ourselves as communities about protecting children, and depending on where you fall, obviously on a political spectrum, that might look different to you than it does to me necessarily, and that's okay. But if we are, a society that is supposed to promote the protection of children, we really need to examine our policing system, and particularly not just that police officers are having sort of real exposure to children and then are able to take advantage of it in this way, but also that our legal system is not holding officers accountable. And of course, you can have, as I do, like sort of varying opinions on incarceration. But we know that at least the legal system as it stands is incarcerating some people, particularly like Black and brown people, for enormously long sentences that are oftentimes even nonviolent. And then, of course, the legal system is not incarcerating the very people who are tasked with enforcing the law, even when they are convicted of raping a child. So there's a lot there, and I'd be happy to talk about it more. But if you'd like to, I'm also happy to I like to read this. I'm happy to send the link to this Washington Post investigation because it is excellent.
Rachel, I'm going to
Um,
post everything that you send me. So thank you in
yeah.
advance. There was a question while we were sort of who's who gets victimized. Gwen asked about trans women. Do you know
Mm.
if and I'm guessing that that's another group that's harmed.
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, first off, of course, trans people, particularly trans women, in general, face sexual violence at rates that are far greater than their cis counterparts. I believe the last time I was sort of researching, I don't know why my doorbell just went off, so sorry. I believe last time I was researching sort of sexual violence against the trans community, it was about half of all trans people report experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime. And then, of course, in police sexual violence, the same kind of trends that we know to be true when it comes to both policing and sexual violence as a whole remain and are often, I'll say, like exacerbated. So, police officers absolutely can target trans people, trans women with sexual violence. Actually, just this week, after many, many, many months of attorneys trying to sort of pressure the San Francisco DA, finally, a deputy sheriff in San Francisco who was accused like 2 years ago now of sexually assaulting a trans woman who was in custody is finally facing a criminal charge. It took way too long. Even her attorneys had like filed like many sort of like civil pieces of litigation to argue that the San Francisco DA was, stalling or not being willing to press charges, despite the fact that there was a ton of evidence. And I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that deputy sheriff was also accused of sexually assaulting another trans woman in custody. So it's shocking also how long it can take to actually get charges pressed against law enforcement. But it happens so often that trans people are targeted by sexual violence, by law enforcement with sexual violence. And um, I'm trying to think about how to say this. I think it's I guess a similar dynamic in that for really understandable reasons, the trans community feels like the policing system is not there to protect them. It's not there to care about the experiences that they're having of violence, of abuse by the system itself, of course. And so I think a similar dynamic exists in that police officers can manipulate that to their advantage, that they believe a trans person would be unlikely to report that this has happened to them back to law enforcement, which is so devastating. And it really gets, again, to the question I ask often, which is where do we go for help if the very people that we're told, I guess, to go to for help are the very people hurting us? That's a really excellent question. And again, many of the same sort of trends that we see in sexual violence and in policing are all reflected in the data about police sexual violence. I guess to me, I think of what I can share with you all is what are pieces of information that you might not know. But I trust that many people here who work in the space of trauma or the nonprofit field or working with survivors know that, of course, people of color, trans people, queer people, disabled women, women who are experiencing homelessness, people of all genders, experience sexual violence at enormously high rates compared to sort of cis, white, upper class people. So that definitely still exists in this data. But really wanted to try to highlight again anything that I can share that comes sort of specifically out of what I've observed. But a really great question. Thank you. Um, Moving forward, again, talking about young people, I find I this is these are the sort of slides or the information that impacts me the most emotionally. I consume again a lot of this case information frequently, but I still, when I read about police officers taking advantage of their positions with children, absolutely get very impacted by that information. And I'm, I think a lot of people might assume that I'm like enormously desensitized at this point, and to be candid, I'm really not. This is still just as devastating to me as it was a few years ago. But I think it's good to for me to still feel that because I think it drives my work more intently than if I was kind of just like numb to it by this point. But of course, school resource officers and police explorers programs are two settings in which law enforcement are we're sort of, I hate to use the word, but routinely sexually abusing children. So, school resource officers or officers who are placed in schools, really, as opposed to being placed at like a precinct or patrolling their community, are statistically significantly more likely to be arrested for sex crime compared to their counterparts. That comes from a study from a couple of years ago from, I think it's like the Chicago Lawyers Association. I'm also happy to send that piece of research as well later to Amy so she can send it all out to you if you'd like. They've done a bunch of really incredible research on the effectiveness and also the threat of school resource officers and um, particularly getting to this idea of does anyone feel safer with cops in schools? And at least the survey data is showing us that young people don't report feeling any safer having a school resource officer there than if they weren't there. So in reality, what we're doing is more so creating circumstances in which police officers have an immense access to children. And that being said, just last week, a deputy sheriff in Florida was arrested for raping students on duty and even in his at school office. I will say, on that case particularly, one of the things that drives me crazy is when I'm reading about a case in an article, and the language being used is a police officer had sex with a 15-year-old girl. And of course, as many people here probably understand, a grown adult can't have sex with a 15-year-old girl. A grown adult can only sexually assault a 15-year-old girl. And I find that very frustrating, particularly when we're talking about officers, that sometimes there can be a use of like more passive language that, of course, I think can sometimes sort of shadow the like real violence that's happening to young people at schools. Really quick, I'm gonna check the chat, make sure I'm not um, making sure I'm.
There's a little bit of chat about officers and in schools in Worcester. We had SROs for a long time, and lots of people work really hard to get them out. And now, with the current climate being so pro police and so anti accountability, it's very worrying.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, the for me the concept of police officers in schools is there's so many layers to that, and I don't want to necessarily get too off topic in terms of the debate around SROs. Well, all I know from my work is that again, this setting of having officers in schools with, and again, that kind of really implicit real power, legal power, but also this real implicit social power that young people feel when they are around an officer of intimidation and deference towards kind of whatever they say creates these situations in which sexual abuse is unfortunately able to happen regularly with very little intervention, especially because school resource officers are often alone in school settings, as opposed to if they're at like a precinct, they're around other officers. It really allows them to be enormously powerful with very little intervention in a school setting. And then I really wanted to also talk about police explorers programs. If you don't know what a police explorers program is, they're youth development sort of programs for young people who may be interested in a career in law enforcement one day. And they are in the same vein as, Scouts America or other settings where adults have a lot of access to children, known to be incredibly predatory environments. This is a really excellent piece again, this one by the Marshall Project about police explorers programs and just how much sexual abuse happens in them. I will say, knowing, of course, that speaking to a community of people in Massachusetts, I do always think about the story of what happened to Sandra Birchmore, if anybody is familiar, a young woman who was from Massachusetts. I'm forgetting where exactly, maybe Stockton. I'm forgetting where exactly she was from, but her story is enormously devastating. She was a young person, a young girl who, as a teenager, was participating in police explorers programs, and was really preyed upon by multiple different police officers in that program. And as a teenager, was kind of coerced into a sexual relationship with multiple officers. I mean, some of these details are, I have to say legally, I have to say alleged. But she fell pregnant with one of the officers who, was again sort of coercing and grooming and sexually abusing her. She fell pregnant with one of those officers' children, and then while she was still pregnant, was found dead for I'm sorry to be so blunt. And just recently, actually, I think the last year, an officer was arrested for killing her and trying to stage it as though she had killed herself. Um, that story happened several years ago now. But I think about her often, and again, that unfortunately, like the outcome of her experience is heartbreaking and devastating. But there are so many cases and stories that really reflect hers happening across the country at all times. I personally don't believe police explorers programs should be able to exist because they give, again, these enormously powerful, mostly men, an enormous amount of one-on-one access to children. And there just really isn't a need for that, in my opinion, particularly if we have seen over the course of decades so many people sexually abused in these settings. If anybody's interested, the Marshall Project also has a really sort of long, very respectful piece about Sandra Birchmore that I'd also be happy to send along with all these other articles. I know that that's really painful, and it's really painful for me even to name as somebody who has spoken about Sandra Birchmore for years now, because it's just devastating, and it's devastating to think about how long those officers were able to do that, and only like very recently has anybody been arrested. So, again, every single year, officers are arrested for sexually abusing children in these programs. This is still absolutely ongoing, despite the fact that maybe this article is from a couple years ago. I mean, every single week, I often see police officers arrested for child sexual abuse against children that they've met in these youth development settings. Still absolutely happening. And that's sort of like one setting particularly where I think to myself, this doesn't have to exist. We don't have to have these. Or if we want them, they could look much different than they look right now. Um, but I'll move forward because I could talk about Police Explorers programs for a long time. I know like there's that online trend of like people's like Roman Empire. I feel like my Roman Empire is Police Explorers programs. I could talk about it for a very long time. But I did want to, just, after talking about something as again like heartbreaking and painful as learning about an immense amount of child sexual abuse, again by the very people who are tasked with enforcing the law. I did want to kind of move towards the end of my presentation by giving a few pieces of information regarding what on earth could we do about the state of police sexual violence. I tell people really often that for a really good reason right now. A lot of people in the current political climate might see things around them and think to themselves, there is just like nothing that we can do about this. You know what I mean? Like it's just like this, and there's nothing that we can do. And the only potentially good outcome of the fact that so little is being done about police sexual violence is that there is actually a ton that we could do if we really wanted to sort of aim a spotlight on this with a considerable amount of effort that both from a legislative perspective and a community-oriented perspective, there is a lot to actually be done when it comes to police sexual violence. One of them, of course, is closing the law enforcement consent loophole in all 50 states. The law enforcement consent loophole is the is the common term for the fact that in almost half of all U.S. states, no laws exist that prohibit an on-duty police officer from engaging in sexual activity with those in their detention. Um, there used to be far more states, it was well over half, who didn't have any laws that prohibited sexual activity in this setting. There was a wave of many states kind of at the end of the 2010s, but still, almost half, I think like 22 states, still have no laws that prohibit an on-duty police officer from trying to use their power to engage in sexual activity with someone who is in their detention. Um, and again, in this setting, I'm sure everybody can likely agree that anybody with a pretty elementary understanding of consent can probably understand that nobody can consent to sexual activity in police custody. The power imbalance is far too extreme. If one person has the ability to handcuff you, point a gun at you, tell you you're going to be incarcerated for as long as they want you to, threaten to use their legal power against your friends, against your family, against the people that you care about. And one person has all of that power and the other person has none of that power. That power imbalance is far too extreme for there to be actual proper consent. I always remind people that real meaningful consent can only occur when someone feels free to say no. And there won't be any consequences or punitive consequences to saying no. And many people, for understandable reasons, feel they cannot say no to an on-duty police officer who has them in custody, which means meaningful consent cannot take place. Of course, as I mentioned, almost half of all US states don't recognize this power imbalance. So what happens is that an on-duty police officer can use this power to coerce, manipulate, and sexually assault someone in their detention. And as long as that officer claims that that activity was consensual, it is enormously difficult to prove in court that it was in fact non-consensual because we've built a legal system that inherently trusts the testimony of a police officer more than it trusts the testimony of somebody who has been put in police detention. Again, there at the end of the 2010s was a lot more discussion on this, and then kind of faded out. Unfortunately, though, still many states do not have any laws that prohibit this environment that is so ripe with sexual assault. In Massachusetts, however, I wanted to specifically name that there is a state law that prohibits sexual activity between law enforcement and those in custody. Now, the difficulty comes from those who are left out of being considered officially in custody. And I'll probably will take a beat on this slide for a second to talk about the fact that in the vast majority of states, so again, half of U.S. states generally have a law that says a law enforcement officer cannot engage in sexual activity with somebody who is in their custody. The vast majority of states, though, I'm saying like I think it's only like 3 states in the whole country say an on-duty police officer cannot engage in sexual activity with those who have called the police for help. So again, going back to one of my slides earlier, talking about what are the settings in which people are really being targeted with this violence, there are no legal protections for somebody who has called the police for help that then prohibits an on-duty police officer from using that environment to try to coerce someone into sexual activity. Massachusetts does not have a law that prohibits that. So there are many people who are left out of being considered officially in custody. And again, I talk about these settings in which people are unofficially detained, like traffic stops, or if someone pauses you on the street, or if you're just being held outside of a store, outside, or in any setting in which you are not like handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, but there are still settings in which we feel detained by law enforcement because we are not free to do whatever we want. And yet, these laws don't extend to those settings. And of course, you're being questioned, or maybe you're a witness to a crime. Maybe, there are you're being interrogated for something. And these legal protections don't extend to those settings. I think it is, again, just particularly really, really so disheartening and like, pardon my language, but just like fucking crazy that there are no laws in the vast majority of states that say a police officer cannot respond to a victim of a crime who's calling for help, cannot try to use that as a means to engage in sexual activity. But again, it's only like a handful of states. It's like Kentucky and one other state, I think, shockingly, has includes victims of crimes calling for help in their law that closes the law enforcement consent loophole. So I say we have to close the law enforcement consent loophole in all 50 states. Of course, in all 50 states, we need to make sure that on-duty police officers cannot use this power to sexually assault people in their custody. But the best practice, like the gold standard, would be to include all of these other people, all these other settings in which people can be sexually assaulted by law enforcement in whatever law ends up closing the law enforcement consent loophole. So this is, for example, one thing that if anyone felt so inclined could rally around in Massachusetts, that our law is not as inclusive and robust as it needs to be, because absolutely, I have seen time and time again cases of women who have called again, particularly domestic violence survivors, but women who called the police for help in Massachusetts, who end up reporting being sexually assaulted by the officer who they called for help. So I think that, yeah, again, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in the law enforcement consent loophole. And particularly the ways in which these laws are designed can give people, particularly like lawmakers, and the sense that, well, that we've closed it, it's fixed now, we have this legal protection. But the language can be so specific and is often created in collaboration with police departments and particularly police unions, that the language is very specific in terms of what that legal protection actually covers. This is kind of my final slide, and one that we can sit on for a little bit, or I'm happy to click off of my slides and be able to look at everybody directly. But we really can do so much when it comes to police sexual violence and addressing it in a way that feels holistic, and addressing it in a way that examines the systemic nature of sexual violence and of the policing system. There are many changes that we could make, both legislatively in our community through our city council, like getting SROs out of schools, or expanding these legal protections so that if a woman says that they've been sexually assaulted by a law enforcement officer after they called the police for help, they're included in the law that prohibits the activity from happening. I always think about, again, that question of where do you go for help if the very people tasked with enforcing the law are supposed to be serving and protecting the community are the very people hurting you? What are other resources that we might need in order for more people to report that this has happened to them and be able to have access to justice in whatever that ways feel right to them? I think that systems of violence and oppression, one of the biggest things that they can do is really steal our imagination, make us feel really beholden to what is only considered pragmatic by the powers that be. And I always try to really emphasize to people that our world can look however we want it to. Of course, it takes an enormous amount of dedication and time and focus, and it might not necessarily even change in our lifetime. But all of the systems that we have around us, we created and we can change them. And so, kind of at this end of my presentation, I really want to emphasize that sitting in your imagination about the systems around you and how they could change is really, really important. And it's a great question to think about. Like, what could a community look like? Of course, that approaches police sexual violence seriously, but approaches so many forms of oppression and violence, particularly by the legal system, by our policing system. What could our community look like that actually approaches these forms of oppression seriously and might actually prevent them? These are just a handful of ideas that I often talk about, but there are so many more that, again, with through people working together and an enormous amount of sort of like effort and resilience, maybe sort of one day we might be able to create a world in which this is actually prevented and survivors are actually protected in the way that they deserve to be. That I'm looking at my time. That is about an hour. I'm really glad that I timed that as best as it could. I know that I can speak very quickly. It's just getting through a lot of information. But if it's okay with everybody, I would much prefer to click off of my slides and be able to see your faces. And I'm always happy
Please,
to bring the
yeah.
slides back up if someone's like, "Oh, I wanted to ask a question about this one slide, or I wanted to go back to this." But I always feel weird whenever I'm sharing slides and I can't see everybody's faces and then people are asking questions.
There's
But thank
been
you
a
for
lot
listening
of
and hanging up.
questions in the chat. There's a lot of stuff that's come up. And I think, as you know, people here have directly faced the challenges that the of going against Worcester Police. So yeah, I will open it. Rachel, that was such great information, so important. I'm so glad like every single slide had really good information. Um, and the beautiful timing of having this information, before the city council considers the question of having a civilian review board. Um,
Yeah. I could pick everybody's brain about that for a while, and honestly, we still can. I was gonna look through some of the chat really fast, but again, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I know that it's a tough hour. It's a tough hour of a lot of painful information to consume, and I think most settings, some people are coming in with a base level knowledge on some of this, and I know plenty of people who I speak to who are like, this is all brand new to me. I had no idea this was going on. So I don't know if there's a the best way to go about this. If I see someone has their hand raised and a ton of people in the chat, so I'm happy to maybe ask anybody who has their hand raised to ask me a question, and then I can just go through the chat afterward.
yeah, great. Bill is a good friend of Worcester, addresses childhood trauma, and has a lot of his own experiences with the Worcester Police. Thank you so much for being here, Bill, and for all the things that you continue to do to speak truth to power.
You know it. Thank you, Amy, for allowing this platform to be here so we can do things like this. And thank you, Rachel, very much. That was the most amazing presentation. A lot of it, I unfortunately have a lot of knowledge about. So it was good to hear that your research is encapsulated, the things that I've seen and been exposed to. I don't really have a question as much as I have a couple of questions, but right now I just want to say that as a man and as a former Worcester police officer, I just personally want to apologize to all the women out there, all the children out there, all the folks out there who have been assaulted and taken advantage of by police and men in general. It's absolutely disgusting. And I tried so hard in the 10 years that I was in the police department to do something about it. And I pretty much got my head handed to me for it. So um, thank you for the work that you do. I would love to engage with you later on because I have some really deep dives that I'd love
Sure.
to get into with you. And but I don't want to take up too much time here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, one, thank you so much. That was really kind of you, and that feedback really does sit with me. And I actually hear really often, I get messages from people who are former law enforcement, who similarly, one of the reasons why I kind of say, I haven't really seen a lot of um, successful cop intervention in these things is because most people who try are in many different ways forced out of the police department, whether that's being forced to resign or quitting, and it's enormously difficult. It seems to really change culture, particularly when it comes to misogyny and violence against women. I get a ton of messages from people who similarly kind of worked in law enforcement and realized, oh my God, this is not sort of changing in the way that I kind of hoped it to be. So I appreciate your feedback, and it does mean a lot to me. Um, Anybody else with their hand up really fast? Oh, Ophelia?
Hi, Rachel. Nice to meet you. I do have a few questions. I did drop one in the chat. So my question was just with the cultural factors of deep-rooted racism in our country. How do you think these cultural factors affect the statistics of gendered violence against women of color, specifically Black and Latino women in this country?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. And there are I mean, again, as I was kind of trying to mention in sort of my brief presentation, that all of the trends that we understand about violence against women, in the sense that women of color, Black women, Latino women, women from particularly, right now, especially with ICE and Customs and Border Protection, are being targeted very often. I will say, as particularly undocumented women are being targeted very often by police sexual violence right now. And again, it really goes to this, I'll say, like, intentional predation that undocumented women feel as though they cannot report to the police if they have been sexually assaulted by the police, because there are so many mitigating factors that leave them enormously vulnerable by our legal system right now. And I think about it all the time, especially in our current political climate, how it is almost impossible to know what I can only imagine is like a staggering number of immigrant women, Latino women, women of color, who are experiencing police sexual violence. And because of the historical oppression of women of color by the legal system, feel there is absolutely no avenue for them to report what has happened to them. And also, what does that mean in terms of access to resources? Depending on where you are, you have to have a police report to get crime victims compensation and what have you. So what does that mean if we have no avenues for people to report these things? How else does it block their access to the support and the help and the again, justice and however they see fit? We leave people with really nowhere to go. But I think really often, again, about particularly undocumented women right now. But there have been so many sort of whole department-wide uh, stories and cases of police departments preying on Black women. Of course, I don't know if anybody's familiar with police officer Daniel Holtzclaw, who was also, I believe, convicted in 2018 of using his time as a police officer to pretty much almost exclusively prey on Black women coercing them under the threat of arrest, and to engage in, of course, non-consensual sexual activity. And it's just devastating. You hear so many stories, particularly of women of color who feel, of course, that the legal system is not there to protect them, and what what happens is when it comes to their access to safety and justice. Again, we leave people with really nowhere to go. But thank you. That's a great question. And one that I think about really often, especially as I gather this information, there are a lot of mitigating factors for me to even know this data.
And we know in Worcester, racism was specifically called out throughout the Department of Justice report. And even though, this data didn't look at the intersection, I'm so sure you're right. I'm so sure that women of color are being even more victimized by the Worcester police than white women. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rachel, that struck me, and all the things that you presented was how much the ability to get away with the crime is like driving the crime, right? Like how much, like when they have access to people that don't have rights, when they have access to people in isolation, when they have access to people in custody, like it feels so calculated that they're like, am I going to get away with this? Probably. I'm doing it. Like it's just, and I know you do cover on all of your social medias, but we didn't really talk about here, like the absolute disproportionate sentencing.
Oh,
Like,
sure.
right? Like
Yeah.
if Bill committed that crime, he would never see the light of day. If a white police officer commits the crime, maybe they get a slap on the wrist. Like that has been really painful. And I know there are other people in this Zoom room today that can share that, is how much the criminal justice system seems complicit and cooperative in all of this.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, definitely.
what
It's
the
enormous. It's an enormously good point, and I just wanted to mention, particularly when it comes to my ability to like track, the backgrounds and the identities of who's been impacted by this violence. It's a good thing, I think, that most arrest reports and most local journalists covering this issue really anonymize who's been impacted. I would love to get to the point where I'm able to do more of like a nationwide survey where people, women can they themselves report they've experienced this and um, identify themselves with the identities, of course, that they hold, and to be able to more properly understand who is particularly getting targeted from like a marginalized identity perspective. So it's a good thing that in a lot of ways we don't know necessarily always a ton about the identities of who's being impacted, again, because people are anonymizing those cases, which is again for privacy reasons, but it's also in conversations like this, it would be enormously helpful to be able to look at, whose identities are being targeted. And I think the reason why I bring up so often um, these things that we generally already know about the state of policing and sexual violence when it comes to marginalized communities and identities that are so targeted by the legal system is we can assume that those things apply and are only exacerbated in the setting of police sexual violence. But going back, of course, to the conversation about sentencing, yeah, that is something that I talk about a ton on social media, which is this absolute like enormous discrepancy between I've seen sentences of, young, like 18-year-old like black men who weren't even around when somebody was shot and killed, and somehow they are being convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 50 years in prison, and they weren't even on the block where someone was shot. And meanwhile, I've read cases of white police officers who pled guilty to raping a 13-year-old girl repeatedly. And this is a true case out of New York State. The officer was given 10 weekends in jail. He didn't even have to go to jail during the week. He was only given 10 weekends. And unfortunately, there's so much to examine there because that plea deal, of course, is created with prosecutors and a judge and defense attorneys, and the legal system itself is obviously really complex, but also intrinsically really connected. Um, and and the further I go on in this work, the more, to be candid, like I'm starting to examine the complicity of prosecutors in protecting and law enforcement, um, and even creating settings in which, again, law enforcement officers are being pleading guilty, being convicted, and not always even having their license to be an officer taken permanently. So I have also read of so many cases where an officer isn't necessarily even just fired. They are genuinely found guilty through the legal system, which is enormously difficult to find a police officer guilty of anything in the legal system. And a few years later, they are able to move to a different state, sort of, and become a police officer again, which is absurd. Uh, so sorry, I'm looking through the chat just to make sure that I'm not missing anything.
Attell, if you want to jump on, please do. Attell is a former city councilor who you may have heard about, who
Sure.
is no longer a city councilor entirely because she spoke out and acted against Worcester Police, like entirely because of her questioning police. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I'll just keep my camera off for a minute, but Rachel, you brought such a wealth of information, but the point that you made about the complicity of the justice system, which we know is not really meant to render true justice, has been playing out here in Worcester in many settlements that the city has had to millions in dollars of taxpayer dollars. But we saw in just the recent prosecution of Ashley Spring and I, uh, in a more explicit way, how those systems were clearly colluding, protecting each other. And this is just a fraction of what we can see because things were made public. But there's so many other community members who haven't had a chance to go through those, um, those systems because they ended up pleading, because that is how the pressure works behind the scenes. And if you don't have the resources to hire attorneys or have pro bono legal support, we never find out what actually happens behind the scenes. And so we got a small glimpse just the last year, and it was pretty terrifying to see how things actually play out in the injustice system, I would call it. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to speak.
Of course. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your insight. Also looking at your questions in the chat, there's just so much there, particularly as we examine the legal system. And I think that particularly in the last decade, I think a lot of people who necessarily maybe hadn't really, particularly white people who hadn't really like examined the policing system really intently. Potentially now, I find I'm having more and more conversations about prosecutors and the legal system itself. And of course, a lot of this information to people of color, men of color, women of color here, like, yeah, I've known this my whole life, and I like really want to hold space for the fact that some of this information, of course, feels new to some of us, and to other people like who've been living this since they were young, and of course, really being preyed upon and targeted by police violence. Um, there's just so many, of course, like layers to police violence and police sexual violence, but also in a way, in it feels almost sometimes to me, and maybe it's just from a consequence of researching this for so long, like almost like simple that like this is a group of people we have empowered with our money, publicly funded, and for decades, if not centuries, they have been, a lot of them have been using that power and that funding to hurt the very people they tell us they are going to protect. Again, yeah, I'm looking at some of the comments in here. I wanted to look at um, one of Attell's questions, actually. What is the status of organizing across the country that you know of around the immense harm of police unions in blocking community efforts? Yeah, it's part of my language, but police unions are a fucking beast. They across the board. I know a little bit just from my own sort of research and speaking to people about how powerful the Worcester Police Union is. I know a lot more personally, to be candid, about the NYPD's police union. and can speak a bit more specifically to their real effort to block community sort of engagement when it comes to policing in general. And also, to be specific, they also work to prevent community sort of activism when it comes to police sexual violence. So there's a bit of context to this, but New York City actually does have a civilian complaint review board. And there are differing sort of, I'll say, opinions on its efficacy. I think civilian complaint review boards are great and necessary, and yet they are also, in most settings, pretty limited in terms of their power. So, for instance, in New York, someone can report to the CCRB, as it's called, that they have been sexually assaulted by a police officer. And the CCRB might investigate that and find that there is real evidence that suggests that this assault took place. Unfortunately, the CCRB has no legal power. So they have to refer that evidence back to the NYPD. And the NYPD still gets to be the one to decide whether or not someone is arrested. So that's like one of the criticisms of a civilian complaint review board is to have one be really effective. It has to be emboldened with enough power to actually to hold an officer accountable. Because unfortunately, if you refer all of the actual sort of acts of accountability right back to the police department, we end up with sort of the same obstacles. But in 2018, the CCRB in New York shared that they would start to investigate police sexual misconduct. Before then, they weren't taking complaints. They would say that that's not for us. They weren't taking complaints of police sexual misconduct. 2018, they announced they're going to start. They go through like 4 or 5 years of litigation with the NYPD's police union because the PBA, the Police Benevolent Association, that's their union, immediately sues and says that police sexual violence is not actually an abuse of police power. That's like outside the purview of the power that the CCRB was originally given. I go back and forth, they go back and forth. That is actually, if you're ever curious, like my origin story as to how I got into this work was actually that I was put on a team in graduate school tasked with writing a very long document in support of the CCRB investigating police sexual misconduct. And I just kind of happened to be randomly put on that team. And through having to research a ton is how I ended up getting really into this. So that's why I actually know a lot about the complaint review, civilian complaint review board here. Anyway, they go back and forth, they go back and forth. And finally, in the early 2020s, the CCRB is able to start taking complaints of police sexual misconduct. But the way they take those complaints means that they are folded into all abuses of power, all like categorized under almost like an excessive use of force. So it's frustrating as well, because if you look up the CCRB's data, you actually cannot see just how many complaints of sexual misconduct they have received because of the way that they're folded into other categories of abuse of power. Now, I give all that context to say just recently, and I mean like, I think it's like the end of May, the NYPD's police union sued the CCRB specifically because of police sexual misconduct. What happened was the CCRB is obviously a public agency. Public agencies have to comply with public records requests. That is not up to them, whether or not they just have to follow the law. And they're particularly in New York State and also like across the country, there are all these initiatives to have these websites that aggregate when police officers are accused of misconduct. And so the CCRB over the course of the last few years has just been complying with their like legal necessity to answer public records requests when people ask, has this officer been accused of any form of misconduct? What the NYPD has argued is that the release of that information, again, that the CCRB legally has to comply with, the release of that information when it comes to specifically sexual misconduct allegations has impacted their social lives. They are starting to feel like their families are judging them or their friends are judging them if their names end up on these websites that say they have been accused of sexual misconduct. And they argue that particularly it's in these cases where they've been exonerated, so to speak, which they haven't been exonerated because the CCRB isn't the legal system. Unfortunately, they have no legal power. But there are so many complaints filed to the CCRB that end up being public that take forever to investigate. So that or they never really found a clear outcome because of how difficult it is to investigate police sexual violence. And now, this is a long-winded way of saying that the NYPD's police union is suing to argue that any complaint of police sexual misconduct to the CCRB that is still pending or did not, there wasn't a determinate outcome at the end, should be blocked from being able to ever be released to the public. Um, it's pretty disheartening to think about because in the layman, what that means is that officers who have been accused of sexual misconduct to the CCRB, and it's taking years to investigate them, can just remain as a police officer and still patrol their streets and still exist in their community. And if public records requests are being blocked, we'll never know that officer has been accused of that. So, to be candid, I have no idea I don't really have a prediction when it comes to what the outcome of that lawsuit is going to be. Because the NYPD's police union is enormously powerful, as it is kind of everywhere. From what I've heard, the Worcester Police Department is police union specifically, sorry, is so powerful. And I think it's also just really interesting, not to like go on a whole other tangent, like the role in which police unions play as opposed to like every other union culturally. That like they kind of break a lot of our understandings about unions and solidarity and worker solidarity, because the police unions are hold such a different social power than every other union. And so often you'll see, depending on what side of the political aisle that you're on, people will be kind of against unions, except police unions. They'll have a very strong allegiance to police unions because of, being very pro-police. So, yeah, it's a really long-winded way of answering that question, but that is all just to say police unions are enormously powerful and absolutely block a ton of community activism when it comes to just policing in general, and of course, very specifically, police sexual violence. I saw somebody had a hand up, and I just want to make sure that I didn't miss that.
It was me. I put it down. I'm wondering, like, what can we do moving forward to throw ourselves into this effort a little bit more? We're- we can follow you for like,
Yeah.
your commentary on the topic. I know you mentioned the Marshall Project a lot. Are there some other, I know specifically here in Massachusetts, because of MCI Framingham, there is a campaign for like incarcerated women's rights. I think it's called the Free Her campaign, but I'm not entirely sure. But what else can we do to follow up on this issue and to keep it alive, so that we can foster more awareness of this in our community? Because I think a lot of what we're running into in Worcester specifically is that people, the union here, like we were just talking about, is so strong, and their reputation in the community because of all of the effort that the police put into public relations is so sparkling to so many other people who are not impacted by this violence every day, that we're fighting a losing battle, right? And getting everybody else in the community to understand and to feel what we've felt. What else, what can we do as just regular folks to stay involved with this?
So, excuse me, it's a really fantastic question, and thank you for asking, and one that I think about all the time. Because, of course, I come up against this idea that I'm posted a lot on the internet about this, and yet also, okay, what can be done? And of course, there's a breadth of different like levels of like sort of like commitment that someone could engage in, and I don't think that every single person needs to like fully like tomorrow go to their state house and start talking to state senators, because that's difficult and takes time, and people live lives, and I do think systems of oppression keep us constantly having to work, an ability to take time off, an ability to focus. In moments that we do have free time, we feel we need to like rest and relax, and it's all I think all very intentional to keep us keep our plates full. That being said, I think really simply, and something that I have found effective is just trying to engage in conversation with people who really have no idea the state of police sexual violence. And one of the reasons why I started collecting this data was because I wanted to talk to people in my life about this issue, and I felt I had no numbers, I had no research to engage with. And to be candid, I would love to say, oh, this one organization has been doing this for years, or this one organization or agency is really dedicated to examining this across the country. It is such a neglected and under-addressed part of police violence that there is very little when it comes to being able to just point to one organization. Not just, I'm sure, and there are plenty ones that I know of that nonprofits that maybe here and there touch the topic of police sexual violence and care about it, of course, but nothing solely dedicated to it. That being said, I think being able to have conversations, and I really lead with that question that I have repeated many times. And to be honest, again, I'm from Ohio. So when I started telling my parents, I am really dedicated to researching the policing system, and particularly this really common epidemic of police sexual violence. My parents were kind of confused because they didn't know that it was happening. And this notion that the police department themselves are the ones using that power to go sexually assault people felt like it broke their understanding of that, again, social contract. And I found that question of where does a woman who is being domestically abused by their cop partner go for help, as if her only option is the colleagues of her partner. And in starting there, I find can be effective because it's examining this dynamic that I would argue all of us likely know someone who has experienced sexual violence or domestic violence. And it's able to illuminate this dynamic that they can then think of in their own lives. What would they do? What would the person that they care about do? And often what comes from that question is, oh shit, there is nowhere for them to go. And then that can move into potentially a conversation of, okay, well, how can we build a community where those people aren't left out of safety and justice? And again, I keep repeating in whatever justice looks like. And to many people, including domestic violence survivors, justice looks different for everybody. But making sure at the very least, those people, particularly those women, are included in being able to name what justice looks like for them, I think is important. So I think having conversations and starting from a place of really just questioning the systems around us, and then of course, and I do feel a little bit like it's my responsibility to almost like give everybody like little rebuttals to like the comments I often get, because I often get like, oh, well, that's bad, but like everybody can sexually assault somebody. And then I always kind of respond with a, yeah, but law enforcement have handcuffs and the weight of the legal system behind them and guns. And so if that's true, that's different than a lot of people will tell me, well, teachers get caught engaging in child sexual abuse. And of course, that's terrible and absolutely should be held accountable. Fortunately, there are a lot of organizations that dedicate their advocacy and prevention efforts to that topic. But teachers also don't have handcuffs. They don't have the entirety of the legal system behind them. So we have to examine the ways in which being sexually assaulted by a police officer could feel and look very different in terms of your access to justice and safety than if you were sexually assaulted by somebody else. So I think that's one sort of way to garner more awareness is just having these conversations and also being prepared with these like comments and responses that you might know that you're gonna get. And then I think one of the frustrating but also kind of good things about the nature of police sexual violence is that it's inherently an issue that can only be solved locally. Congress, the US Congress, passed a federal law in 2022 that closed the law enforcement consent loophole for federal officers. Um, the issue is that the vast majority of us on an everyday basis only interact with state or local law enforcement, and that congressional law does not apply to them. Very often, when I talk about the law enforcement consent loophole, I'll get comments who are like, "Oh, I looked this up, and they said Congress closed it. So what you're talking about is outdated." And I have to go, unfortunately, the law that Congress passed does not apply to the vast majority of law enforcement that we interact with. Um, it's frustrating that that means that we cannot necessarily mobilize nationally and address this in one fell swoop. But it is also good in the sense that locally you can actually make um, a pretty big impact if you feel confident and safe enough to go talk to your local city council or particularly your state government. I think that there's a lot, again, to be done when it comes to law enforcement consent loophole and ensuring that at the very least um, there is a legal protection here for officers to be held accountable under. The difficulty for so many domestic violence survivors who are sexually assaulted by law enforcement is there aren't legal protections for them to the legal system to hold officers accountable, and then officers and prosecutors can take advantage of those loopholes to not charge officers. So expanding legal protections for all the different environments in which we engage with police officers, and then of course, like I think that there's a lot to be done when it comes to giving police access to children. Like at the end of the day, like it sounded like as Amy mentioned earlier, like whether or not SROs are in your schools is kind of just a local city issue. And of course, it's way easier said than done to get SROs out of schools and then stay out of schools. But that is something that you don't necessarily need, your governor's permission for, your congressional senator for. These are things that we can do sort of locally. And like same thing for police explorers programs. Those can just end. There's no law that says these must be built into the fabric of our communities. Those can just cease to exist. Or if they are continuing to exist, the way that they look can be changed in terms of I've seen settings in which like a one officer is actually legally not allowed to be with young people. There has to be at least two of them because people are trying to mitigate this idea that one cop can take a teenager on a ride along at 11 p.m. at night, and there are no mitigating factors to try to prevent anything from happening. Of course, if you ask me, I don't necessarily know if like just two officers alone are going to really change the nature of police child sexual abuse in these settings. But there are these ideas that people are trying out to see can this reduce the amount of child sexual abuse happening in these settings. And I think again, like the way that that looks, it's a glorified after school program. I think the policing system makes it feel like it's this like really indestructible, like ancient part of our society, and they really aren't. They can be changed in the same way that so much of public school systems get changed all the time. So yeah, I think that's a really long-winded way of answering what can be done. And it ranges all the way from just having conversations with people about this fact that this is happening so often, and we're leaving people with nowhere to go, all the way to like talking to your legislature and just making sure that they're aware that this is happening. And of course, like some legislators might be uh, not inclined to necessarily do a lot of work on the issue, but some very well might be. And I think you'd be surprised, some across political aisles. Like I have spoken to people who, to be candid, like I probably don't agree with like really entirely on all over on the political spectrum, but for whatever reason, um, they are enormously against, police child sexual abuse and want to work to end that. So I'd also say like don't count anybody out either from what that organizing can look like. I'll get like the worst messages from like a young person who you'd think maybe necessarily might be more inclined to agree with me, and I'll get the most supportive, loving, kind messages from like an 85-year-old like white man who you'd think might be more inclined to agree with how the policing system has always been. So anyway, any more questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. I was wondering if you could address victims of sexual assault and having chronic or long-term trauma. Is that
Mm-hmm.
anything that you study?
Yeah, I'd say my knowledge on that is more from my experience as a social worker. I really specifically went into the field of social work to work in the field of gender-based violence. That's like what I went to school for, and worked in various sort of settings, both in nonprofits and universities, doing gender-based violence work. And I think through that is where I've definitely examined the chronic impact of trauma, and that can look a lot of different ways. I think there's a little bit more understanding, I think, in the medical field, more so related to the sciences about the physiological health outcomes of people who have experienced sexual violence or other forms of trauma, particularly at a younger age. And I'm very obviously not a scientist, so I don't want to completely butcher the like physiological like sort of processes that happen, but pretty much the nervous system, if it stays in a state of constant stress, which, depending on your experience of trauma can look different. People can experience a trauma for years and years and years every single day. And of course, that's remaining in a state of stress. But many people who experience one, hour of trauma can still have a nervous system reaction that is prolonged. Um, and the impact of chronic stress on the nervous system is brutal for I was making sure I was not going to sneeze, is really brutal for a lot of people's health outcomes. I would say, like, particularly women of color experience really disproportionately high rates of particularly like autoimmune diseases. And we're finding through just like research that people who experience chronic trauma and that chronic stress are more likely to develop autoimmune diseases as they get older. And so many people as adults who have been diagnosed with autoimmune diseases, you'll often find will like often talk about the fact that yeah, I experienced this chronic trauma when I was a child or in my adolescence or in my early 20s, and can have really difficult health outcomes for people who experience trauma, and particularly one that puts their nervous system under duress for a long time. But then, of course, there are these like sort of more social or societal outcomes to experiencing chronic trauma. The sort of the impact of being disabled, having a disability because of your trauma, the impact of your mental health being affected by a trauma. People who lose their jobs because they've experienced domestic abuse and they didn't show up for a day, or they, had an emotional reaction and then are navigating unemployment or potential homelessness. And there are also all these sort of systemic factors that can also be really devastating for people, not just purely health outcomes that come from experiencing a trauma like this. And that's one of the things that I think, just in general, like even if we set down like police sexual violence specifically, that's one thing I think societally we do a very poor job at understanding that when someone experiences a trauma like sexual assault, like domestic abuse, but also so many other forms of trauma, um, every single part of our lives are impacted. And so easily because our social systems do not prioritize caring for individuals fully. So easily, someone can experience a trauma, and then a sequence of events can happen, and then that person is unemployed or at risk of losing their housing, or they've had their children taken away, or all of these different, or they're struggling with substance abuse or other sort of illnesses. There's so many things that can so quickly occur after a trauma, and we don't, I think, as a society, do a good enough job examining that a trauma isn't necessarily the exact act that occurred in that moment. It is, of course, also so much of the processing aftermath. That was a really great question. I saw that I think was asked actually in the chat by somebody else, so thank you. A really excellent question. Anybody else know that we're running out of time? Everybody's probably really busy.
I was going to
But
say the same thing. You did really cover, yeah, sexual. I don't know specifically police, like police initiated assault, but sexual assault very often has lifelong consequences for people. They struggle throughout their lives with all the things you said at all the levels. Um, and I would imagine that this would be very much even more likely to cause long-term trauma and effects because of the impact of the people that are supposed to be keeping you safe are the ones doing the harm.
yeah.
That you can't underestimate how much that messes with your sense of safety at baseline, safety in your own body.
Absolutely. And just like of course, like the alienation and isolation interpersonally, socially from your community. But we also, depending on where you are, we've also built obstacles um, between people being able to even access again, like um, to get a referral for a therapist, to get crime victims compensation, to even be able to speak to various other resources. Depending on where you are, you have to report to the police in order to get access to those resources built into the system. And again, as I feel like I hope that I've repeated enough, there are really good reasons why people don't want to report that this has happened to them to law enforcement. So when I talk about arrests, I never want to make it seem like only these cases count. There are so many more cases that are happening constantly, but it's enormously difficult to track. I think that's actually I saw somebody in the chat talking about domestic violence and the police as well. I get often asked if I track that, and I would love to. It is almost impossible to track because of the reporting rates are so low, and officers, if they are arrested, are often arrested under charges that are not explicitly domestic violence linked. So, as somebody who's trying to find them, it's very difficult. But I hope one day, and it's definitely a huge issue, and I think a lot about law enforcement for sort of families or children whose parents are law enforcement or wives, spouses of law enforcement who are enormously isolated from resources and justice because the person is a part of their family, which is different, of course. Anybody else? Totally fine if not. I'd also just like, it doesn't have to be a question either. I don't know if there's like anything from like a processing perspective, from like a comment or reaction. I know this is a ton of really, again, devastating information to discuss.
Go ahead, Ashley, jump in.
Yeah, I am curious. Do you have any book recommendations?
Ooh, book recommendations.
Rachel, you should write a book.
I'd love
Yes.
to. I'd love to one day. Yeah, I think
What influences like your thinking? Like what has influenced your work, the most?
I would say it has been a lot of I would say probably like online publications as opposed to like hard copy books. There have
Hmm.
definitely been uh tons of great uh books on the history of policing and like the abuse of police departments that within them touch on police sexual violence as a part of that abuse of power. To be honest, I can't think of one book that focuses on police sexual violence specifically. But there are a lot of articles and journalists that I'm constantly kind of like flagging for like, okay, I want to keep track of their work. I want to see what they're up to. And would be happy to send those over to Amy so then she can send them out to everybody. But the Marshall Project has done a lot of great writing on police explorers programs, but of course, a bit more on police sexual violence as a whole. The Washington Post has that one investigation that I think is great. The ACLU has put out a few more so like legal breakdowns about police sexual violence. Particularly, they were doing more of that in the 2010s. And then there are some nonprofits. There's a great nonprofit that I was really inspired by to um, do more so of a full legal breakdown of the law enforcement consent loophole. They're called decriminalizingsexwork.org. They have a ton of work on police sexual violence as well because like their lived experiences were informing the fact that this is happening and nobody is talking about it.
Hmm.
Um, and then yeah, but to be candid, it is really difficult to get a publishing house or a really big like national mainstream publication online to publish information on police sexual violence, particularly nationally. There are some great reporters out of Chicago, particularly that focus on police sexual violence in Chicago, but again, it's very like specific to a local setting. But I'm also just really happy to keep like relationships with everybody here so that if I come across like, oh my God, I just found this book that came out however long ago, everybody, if you want to learn more, I'm happy to stay connected so that I'm able to flag those things because I feel like I'm still always trying to consume more and going to like the far corners of the internet to try to find it because it isn't really published in a way that's like super mainstream and obvious, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's part of the struggle, right? That's part of the reason that we're always in the dark because
Exactly.
they fight to keep it, hidden.
Exactly. 100%. Like I do hope to one day be able to write a book. Again, I think because this research and that information empowers people to go to, um, of course, the people in their lives, their own parents, like their own friends, their, partners, but also I think information that feels really reputable also really empowers people to go to their elected officials and say, look at all this information that has been heavily edited and reviewed and comes from a really like reputable place about this topic. I think makes people more confident in trying to make change. So hopefully, with time and all of us kind of like working together, we can get there. But to be candid, it's pretty bare bones right now.
Rachel,
Um,
thank you so, so much. I don't know if there's more questions, but just want to say that I feel so much better prepared for city council tonight. Um, your, data points are excellent. Your context setting is excellent. It's so clear how high the stakes are. And I don't think we're going to prevail, but I feel like, like you said, just continuing to bring attention to this topic, letting people who don't don't see this as an issue, who aren't impacted, recognize how devastating this really is, how vulnerable people in our community are to this. And I mean, we've got proof that this is happening in our community. And I so appreciate your offer to continue to be in touch with people here and your offer to give our situation any national attention you can.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
much appreciated. Like we do feel like like it was so powerful for me to just see that this is everywhere, because it feels super oppressive here in Worcester with the police behaving in the way they're behaving. Intent, like people here have been directly harmed by the police, and that's hard. It's hard to live in community under police terror. And thank you for looking at it, and thank you for talking about it. And yeah, if anybody outside of Worcester sees, and if anybody wants to help us, we'll take the help.
Yeah.
Somebody was like, hey, maybe Boston can help, and like, that'd be great, bring it. Like anybody who feels like they want to, sometimes it really does better from outsiders. Like people listen to people outside of our community, in ways that they don't listen to people in our community. And they have the power to harm people in our community that they don't have the power to harm people with a bigger platform and a bigger stage. So we're
Yeah.
really grateful that you have that platform and that stage. We put all your socials in the chat for people
Totally,
to follow.
totally. Yeah, I thank you for that reminder. I actually wanted to kind of to mention this really at the end of our discussion, because I really wanted to be able to speak to everybody sort of first before I mentioned that to me, what's happening in Worcester with the Worcester Police Department and all of the various layers to it, of course, is is very unique in the sense that just through my conversations with Amy and with some other folks that I've met through her, this is um, really you guys know better than me, like difficult to live in and scary. And it is both unique, the dynamics that you are all facing, and yet, of course, I hope reflected in my presentation, happening everywhere as well. I will say I have been thinking a lot about how to get more national attention on what's happening in Worcester. As I think about, I've spoken to Amy quite a bit about the DOJ report and the nature of when that was released. And then, of course, with a new presidential administration, having really nobody at the DOJ to try to help bring some accountability. And it can these conversations can happen offline, but I'd love to speak with more of you about what accountability might look like, and how if there was more attention on what's happening in Worcester from even like a national level, like how that attention and that sort of light might be able to create situations in which accountability might actually be able to be fostered. Because it sounds like the police department feels as though like nobody other than the people in Worcester are watching them, and they're in control of all of you, so they don't feel as though they need to hold themselves accountable or be pressured to have any kind of changes made. So I would like to think that if we could get some more national attention on what's happening in Worcester, that at least that attention and that kind of like watchful eye, that magnifying glass might create an environment in which the police department feels like, okay, we need to make some changes because everybody is talking about us. But of course, who's to say? I would hope that it wouldn't hurt. I wanted to talk to everybody, of course, because the last thing I want to do is try to bring more attention to what's happening in Worcester, and you all feel like, oh no, no, please don't. We are
I don't
already
think you can make it worse. I really
okay.
don't think you can make it
Okay.
worse. I
Okay.
appreciate that you're concerned about that, but I don't think it could be worse, really. I mean, maybe I'll really regret saying that, but it does feel like no harm can come from bigger scrutiny and bigger awareness of what's happening. Go ahead, Ash.
Just pop in and say like this is when things are how can I put this? When things are hidden, right? Like they get away with more. And this is like a common strategy that like male abusers use, right? Like they remove access for like the person to the outside community. And I feel like that's part of the issue is that, we're keeping things hidden here. If more people knew, they would be willing to be like, hey, what the hell? Like what's going on over there, So again, it's part of the strategy to kind of keep
Absolutely.
people, you know.
Definitely. Well, well then yeah, and we can continue speaking again like offline. Of course, I'm sure Amy and I will continue talking, and again, I really encourage anyone here with my email if they want to talk off this call on a different call or just shoot me a message. I'm happy also just to go back and forth via email. Please feel free. I mean, I know that I have like, genuinely no like real historical connection to Worcester, but I feel just from talking to so many people now over the course of the last few months, like
Rachel, you're
deeply,
welcome here
deeply
anytime.
connected
Come
to
on
what you all
over.
are going through.
Stay with me. It's gonna be great.
Yeah. I
Would
just feel
love to
very
host you.
invested in trying to do really anything in the hopes that any type of accountability can come from it. And I know today has seemed to be already kind of a big day when it comes to the city council and the police department. So I know we're at time and I'll let everybody go. Good luck tonight for anybody who is going to speak to city council. And please let me know, of course, anybody, particularly Amy, if I can help in any way today or tomorrow or in the coming weeks when it comes to that specifically.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's so great to see my friends and loved ones. So super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks,
We'll see
everybody.
you next
Thanks,
month, if not
Rachel.
tonight. Thank you,
Bye.
Rachel.
Thanks.